Sightings of dwarves marching southwards to the caverns of the World's Edge Mountains had been first made by the Night Goblins weeks ago. As such, the dwarf caravan led by Baragrim Drakebeard, transporting a dozen cannons to reinforce their brothers in Karak Azul, had no idea that many of the Night Goblin tribes were currently united behind a cunning and merciless goblin shaman. In the depths of the mountains, far from the touch of sunlight, the blood of both races would run once again. A group of master engineers accompanied the caravan. Powerful warriors in their own right, the master engineers were in charge of overseeing repairs and the smooth transportation of the powerful war machines they were carrying. Baragrim Drakebeard, the leader of the throng, led his army as they moved swiftly through the network of tunnels and caverns of the mountains. The dwarves are capable of marching for days on end, being loaded with burdens such as cargo, heavy weapons, and armor. On the way to Karak Azul, they had found less resistance than expected. A few Skaven rat packs and a group of maniacal goblins had all met their doom with the cold steel of their axes. When the Night Goblins found the dwarf caravan quickly advancing south through the caves, they informed their shaman of the incoming party. Some others, driven by madness, had thrown themselves onto the dwarf host, not to be heard of again. The mountain passes and underground tunnels were highly contested, and the area the dwarves were now traversing was considered to be very valuable to all races that needed access to Karak Azul. Night Goblins have infested the vast networks of caverns and tunnels that riddle the World's Edge Mountains for thousands of years. Hidden in deep caverns underneath the mountains, they take great pleasure in taking over the ancestral hall of the dwarves, as they always contain vast treasures. Besides, the Night Goblins were not going to allow an opportunity to slit dwarf throats go amiss. The Squigs and trolls attached to the tribes have grown hungry over the last few months, and new carcasses to feed on were becoming a necessity. The subterranean horde moved out to lay an ambush against the hated incoming foe. Dwarf Killer, the powerful goblin shaman, was sure the unsuspecting dwarves were going to die soon enough. All had been perfectly planned, and not even the stubbornness of the dwarves would keep them fighting for too long. Dwarf scouts were ahead of the main army, trying to locate potential threats and disarming any rusty but deadly traps the sneaky Night Goblins sometimes managed to construct. The main column, counting hundreds of warriors strong, marched hastily through the caverns, in the way only dwarves can. Their target was not far away. Their allies at Karak Azul would soon get the much-needed reinforcements. They were beyond the Death Pass when the reinforcing army entered an enormous chamber. Water was dripping from the stalactites above them. Something seemed suspicious to Baragrim when, as they entered the chamber, no bats flew out. Something must have scared them away. With a rising, high-pitched tone, a giant goblin horn broke the relative silence of the depths. Thousands of screams and roars filled the air as out of the hidden tunnels from behind the rocky formations and from the dark corners of the chamber, an avalanche of goblins and trolls descended upon the dwarf column. Screams of madness filled the place as thousands of Night Goblins were already entering a madness-induced trance, hungry for blood. The dwarf situation was unfavorable. Their forces were spread thinly into a long column, and they were surrounded on all sides by the charging enemy. But this did not faze them. Baragrim was issuing commands at his soldiers as the master engineers rushed to deploy the cannons against the ambush, protected by Baragrim's retinue of warriors. The column rapidly transformed into a double-sided shield wall, with the warriors intermixed with Longbeards and the elite Ironbreakers stretching throughout it. Masterfully deployed by the dwarf engineers, the cannons started to open fire at the enemy formations. The potent shots opening big gaps in the approaching Night Goblins. The deafening sound of all the firepower being unleashed echoed through the entire place, and the smell of gunpowder and blood filled the thin air. The few Thunderers had time to fire a couple of volleys at the enemy before having to put their axes to work. The mobs of Night Goblins were getting closer and closer. As the tight dwarf formation braced for impact, dozens of Night Goblin fanatics were unleashed, spinning crazily and wielding a spiked iron ball. Some of the fanatics managed to crash into the iron wall of the dwarves. The force of the impact sent many sturdy warriors flying backwards, with their bones broken and armor cracked. The first wave of Night Goblins, thinned by the dwarf volley of fire, broke against the mostly steadfast shield wall of the column. Their poorly crafted bows and arrows did little to no damage to the mail-clad dwarf ranks. Horrible squeals echoed against the walls, as goblin after goblin was hewed down with steel axes and artillery power. But the Night Goblins kept coming, emerging from the darkness in black robes. After the initial charge, the cowardly race turned to flight, only to be immediately replaced by the next wave of their kin. A fresh second wave of enemies approaching through the dark as the first retreated. The dwarves now had to withstand a charge of giant cave squigs. Driven mad by their handlers, they rammed into the shield wall, biting away and tearing with their claws against the dwarf warriors. The less experienced did not manage to hold their ground. Screams of agony could be heard as limbs were torn off and bodies were bit into. But this did not lessen the dwarves' determination. Even the great mangler Squigs could not crack the resolve of the Ironbreakers. And the stubborn warriors drove off the assault, smashing Squig heads with Gromreel hammers. At this point, the trolls, finally pushed to fight by dwarf killers barking commands and barely guided by orc bosses, approached the dwarf lines. The hulking monsters grabbed dwarf warriors with ease and ripped their bodies apart with their huge arms, or smashed into their lines with small trees used as clubs or makeshift weapons. Axes did little to hurt them, as they struggled to break through their scaly stone-like skin, and any damage dealt to them, they briskly recovered. Tall and powerful Longbeards, who through their sheer strength resisted the blows of the monsters, were drowned in corrosive vomit, to die an agonizing death as their flesh and bones seared away. The engineers, with the cannons now deployed, did the best they could to blow the huge creatures to pieces, but there were too many trolls and too few crewmen. Baragrim redirected his only unit of Iron Drakes and gave them the order. With haste, they located the main force of trolls and poured through to release what the filthy creatures feared the most: fire. The dark of the chamber was illuminated as the burning bodies of the trolls crumpled to the ground in a loud thump. Any squigs or goblins that assisted them were molten away by the blast. A cry of triumph roared through the dwarf ranks. Motivated by the turn of events, many rushed forward to finish off the retreating Night Goblins. Any remaining squigs dispersed, and control of the trolls was lost, who now preferred not to engage in the fighting. The goblins were fleeing, shouting screams of cowardice. Hundreds of dwarves lay dead, surrounded by thousands of green-skinned corpses, but the cannons remained theirs. As the last of the goblins flew, Baragrim ordered to move out. They had no time to bury the dead. However, as the cannons were being pushed forward, a sound filled the chamber again. The dreaded horde of the Night Goblins. With horror, the bloodied throng saw as thousands of goblins, squigs, and trolls came out of the darkness towards the few remaining dwarves. Baragrim felt as if his heart turned to ice, not because he feared death, but because they had failed to aid their fellow dwarves in Karak-Azul when they were so close. He had failed to redress the multiple transgressions made by the greenskin race to their ancestors. They had only managed to defeat 2 of the tens of waves which were ready for them. This was to be their doom. But Baragrim would not go out easily. He still had revenge ready to be served, and his axe was ready. Just a few hours later, the Night Goblins jeered and laughed as the last of the dwarves was torn apart and feasted upon by the Squigs.
On this channel, we are putting together narrative Total War cinematic battles and Warhammer lore videos. A special thank you goes to our Patreon supporters who help us in the making of more content. You can also directly support the channel through Patreon. Find the link in the description below. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification button to be the first to watch the next video. Thank you for watching and see you on the next one.